Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It is 12:02. So out of respect for everybody's time, we will go ahead and get started. I'm sure some folks will just continue to log in, but welcome to our part one of our series, Redefining Risk for today's brokerages. My name is Rita Blevins. I'm your Director of Professional Development and Liaison for both the Risk Management and Management Central Advisory Group. These two groups are led by Sharon Cox and Jessica McCreary. Thanks. Wanted to, before we officially get started, thank both of them for recognizing the importance of educating everyone on the issues that are redefining your business. Also wanted to share a few housekeeping notes. Today's session will be and is being recorded. It will be redistributed to all of you for registering. For those that didn't register and are maybe missing it, it'll be made available on our HAR TV YouTube channel. Of course, that is har.com/HARTV. Since this is a webinar, you will be able to provide comments and questions in the chat. Feel free to do so at any point. We want this to be collaborative and informative. So we've set some time aside for Q&A near the end of the program. But if something comes to mind and you need clarification about it, or you just have a question, type away, and we will definitely get to it. As I mentioned, this is part one of a series. I'm going to remind you all later about our next couple of events and programs, but in case you pop out early, I want to make sure that everybody gets out their calendar and marks September 28th on their calendar. We are going to have our in-person Management Central Risk Management event. It's going to be in person. We're going to have some amazing subject matter experts come in. It will be kind of a part two of this series, really defining and talking about the different things that we discussed today, but in a more elaborate way. So details will all be distributed soon, but go ahead and just save that date so you don't miss it. And we will send out more information within the next couple of weeks. So today's session is all about laying the foundation of risk factors that you all should be aware of, and then just ideas on how they can or could impact your brokerage. So thankfully, we have our two guests with us today to help define and explain these issues. Many of you are familiar with Jeremy Conaway and Jim Sherry. Jeremy is HAR Strategic Architect, and Jim is our leading consultant. Both have been key in helping HAR lead the way in innovation and growth for more than 20 years. I don't want to date them, so I'll just say 20 years, but definitely since I've been around, they've been a part of our programming and just looking at how we define growth and innovation. So they are constantly doing research just to help us as an industry. Last week, we were able to hear from both of them on Member Focus Monday. They shared their insights on, a broader range of topics. But today we're going to narrow this and narrow the scope to just be more relevant to you, the broker. So we're going to go ahead and just dive in and get started. And I'm going to lead off with Jim. Jim, why has the subject of risk management gained in importance from a management perspective?
Well, there was a time in the not too distant future when risk management was fairly well defined, and it was either writing a bad contract, inaccurate listing information, bad plat with wrong property lines. And what's happened now is we're moved into a much more complex transaction. A recent discussion with Title said that the average transaction now, there's 441 pieces of paper that are used in a transaction. Each one of those is a potential risk, depending on what's on there and whether you pay attention to them or not. So the potential damage from risks is very high also. I mean, if the lady could get $10,000 from McDonald's because the cup didn't say hot, then doing something wrong in a real estate transaction could result in a lot more than $10,000. So the potential for damage is very high. Litigation and regulation are taking a toll on our industry. The CFPB, which is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which kind of fell by the wayside during the Trump administration, has been re-energized by the current administration. And just recently they've said, we're really looking into this idea of that AI, artificial intelligence, in AVMs is potentially racist. And we're going to create some regulation. So there's just one little piece of the transaction that's being focused on. And, so I think the idea that there isn't just the risks there used to be, they're much larger. The other thing that's going on is the relationship between brokers and agents has undergoing a significant change. A lot of agents really act very independent. A lot of new models of the real estate business, agents are almost completely independent, although they're under the guidance of a broker, but that broker may not have a lot of direct control over what the agent does or how they conduct their business. So the other thing that's going on is teams. I saw an ad here, and I live in St. Augustine, and it was for a couple that are very good. They really do a good job. There was no mention on the billboard of the brokerage. There was a mention of the team. And so team identities are another potential risk, because if you're a broker and you have a number of teams that operate and they're operating relatively autonomously, then they're creating risks that you may not even know about because you're not involved in that business at the level you used to be. The other thing is we have a more educated consumer. We have consumers that are looking at property, they're understanding transactions, they're demanding more transparency, and they're willing to take legal action on almost at a drop of a hat. Very, very different litigious society that we live in today, which creates a potential for suits, whether they're legitimate or not. They're still at risk, and you're still going to spend money defending them. In some of the new brokerage models, there's little or no supervision of the agent and or the teams. And so, when you look at it, we sort of have loosened the control, and there's a lot more risk if you're not in control of the process. And so that's the beginning of this piece that Jeremy and I've worked up, which is there's a lot more areas you should worry about. There's a lot more pieces to risk management that there was just a very few short years ago. So that's setting the groundwork. That's it.
Great. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the team structure and how that came into play with the brokers and just expectations and understanding. And then, of course, like you mentioned, we do live in a more litigious society, so those things have to be considered. Jeremy, let's go on what risk management developments have occurred in the real estate industry over the last 3 years that have changed the risk management environment. You're muted.
Sometimes that's good.
Maybe not today, but on a lot of other occasions.
Hello, Miss Rita.
Gotcha. There you go. Thank you.
Mr. Jim. So some of what you'll note, those who are listening to this, there's a number of themes which we're going to continue to repeat throughout this program, and we'll just take them at different angles. And all, there's like 42 things that you have to be dealing with. And the purpose of this program is not to educate you on each one, but make you aware of the fact that in this post-pandemic era, which we're now midway through, there's all sorts of developments, and every one of them has a risk connection to it, which requires risk management. So Jim talked about the several new brokerage business models. Now, some of them produce an organic risk by design, meaning the mere way that the thing is set up invites in additional risk, and that will occur. It was almost designed to do that. Others have just not completed the maturation of their particular model. So we think the new brokerage business models, as they continue to mature and work through, we'll discover that some of them are especially attuned to particular risks. The idea of increased team-based activities, when you think about it, if you have a brokerage and it has a number, as Jim said, a number of brokerage of teams working with it, Those teams, despite the fact that legally they're part of the brokerage, tend to be homegrown, meaning that the person who puts the team together puts their own spin on the activities, and those include activities which generate risk. And so that's the first thing, just by virtue of design, that particular articulation of what they're going to do creates risk. The next thing that happens, of course, is that they're productivity focused. They're not, this is not about a team, it's about a brokerage as much as it about the team, which means that they're very, very focused on productivity and profitability. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what that means is that most teams don't have the resources to do a full risk management program. They're spending their time and energy somewhere else. The other fact is that these teams are largely disconnected from the main ship brokerage. And because of that, they have a higher level of potential. So we think that teams are going to be a buzzword in the area of risk management. The current instability of the housing market, and you know, we cover about 30 publications a day. Everything that's written about the housing market, we capture and put it into our pool. But the current instability of the housing market strongly suggests that the relationship between consumers and agents has likely deteriorated. And this may have resulted in increased consumer agitation, sophistication, or distrust. Again, the mindset of the consumer from their experiences as a result of the multiple offer environment of the hot market, their experience with property devaluation, which is occurring right now. They purchased a house that's now worth significantly less than they paid for it quite recently. And probably during that, they were told that no problem, this house everything will increase in value. Except our experience with having to lower asking prices. We now know that almost 50% of properties currently listed on MLSs over the last month or so have had their prices lowered, their listing prices lowered. All of those things are going to create unhappiness with consumers, which means that they're going, well, you told me this, you told me this, you told me this. So we're creating a rather intense potential of unhappiness with consumers, both present and past, taking some sort of action. And so that's a problem. The increased incidence of litigation and regulation within the industry. Right now, there are several major lawsuits, major meaning with potential awards exceeding $1 billion, that will impact almost every aspect of the business, of the brokerage business. And so that's, again, those, you know, not all of those are going to win, but enough of those will win to create something that we need to be worried about. The emergence of the rental nation. Now, again, what we know is some 40% of properties thereabouts that were sold last year or that were part of a purchase transaction were done by investors, which means you have this rather immense group of folks who aren't looking at how they're going to raise families or decorate or buy furniture. They're just looking at how they're going to maximize their return on investment. And they will be a serious new force in the industry. And as a result of that, that's going to create additional risk. We already have getting reports of rental management techniques, which are somewhat invasive and will probably end up being litigated to some extent. So that creates additional risk. As Jim pointed out, there's increased monitoring and input from regulators across the board. The CFPB just being the one that has some really good public relations activities connected to it. But the fact is, almost every one of the federal agencies, FHA or across the board, are now increasing the level of regulatory behavior. And you know, every time they find something wrong, that's going to create a risk. The increased sophistication of the real estate consumer, I think, is another major one. Jim again discussed that from his perspective. From my perspective, I just think what you have is a lot of unhappy people. If the current trend of property values going down were to continue for any period of time, that means you'll have hundreds of thousands of people who just ended up paying too much for their property. And while no agent hopefully promised them anything, some people will suggest that agents said, no, that no problem, the prices will continue to go up. This will be the investment of the century. Exactly what we heard during the mortgage crisis in 2007 and 2008. So a combination of all these things has created this whole new environment. Now, there are people listening to this who have been in the business for 30 or 40 years, and they'll say, oh, we've been through all of this before. Jim and I are simply trying to get across that, no, you haven't. No one has been through a market like this or an industry like this ever. And so most of the things that are going to happen, while they may seem predictable, with these new factors will not be so predictable. So that requires a lot of respect and attention to the kinds of things that Jim and I are talking about. Rita?
Yeah, and so I think, thank you for that. I think that that's where we're coming from with regards to today's program, is to look at, yes, we've had experienced brokers in the within our membership that have seen drastic changes throughout the last 20, 30, 40 years in some cases. However, it's not just those traditional factors and things that are coming, we want to make you aware of, have things on your radar, be able to think of them in a new way. And it's coming at the brokerage community in a whole, not in a whole new way, but in all different ways, right? There's so many varying factors. So we're going to kind of identify today those traditional factors, and then maybe some things that are on the radar, but you're not necessarily diving deep into and thinking about, and how it could impact. So Jim, generally speaking, how will the new risk management environment impact the brokerage community?
Well, I think there's several things. One is, I wanted to go back to Jeremy's point about the satisfaction of the consumer. If you think about in the past 6 months or 12 months, you've had multiple offers on properties. And does the seller really understand all the offers and what the criteria was? If they ask you which one they should pick, you're creating risk, right? So being able to display the various offers on a property, and I'm going to go to the rental nation thing in a minute, we're starting to see rentals that are now being bid up above asking because there's so many people looking for rentals, and you're going to be involved in it. There's no question about it. So how do you make sure that you're providing all the information, and not just you? The people on the call here are probably more aware, but now you've got here in Houston, 47,500 licensed agents that each one can and will likely stumble into a circumstance where they could create a risk issue for the brokerage. And so, one of the things we have to do is require more education and adherence. The education is something Rita does a lot of, the brokerage does a lot of, but it's nothing like you're going to have to do. I mean, you're going to have to be in a position where you not only make people aware, but you monitor the transactions to make sure that there's adherence to all the pieces of the transaction. In the past, we had a person who managed the transactions because they had a manila folder with a bunch of places they could say, yeah, this is done, this is done, this is done. It's not enough. So now you're moving into transaction management systems. Are they really minimizing your risk, or are they creating more risk? And you need to kind of look at that and say, is technology helping you or not helping you? Then more education, more awareness. It's very difficult right now to have a broker sit down with agents and take the time, have the agents take the time to understand risk and what the awareness is, what they should know about. I mean, they're busy or they're not interested, one or the other. And so your job is going to be harder because the area of risk has spread much wider than the past, and you're going to have to make people aware, and it's going to require closer monitoring. So I think standards of practice is something that we see right now we're beginning to understand standards of practice within a brokerage will allow you to start make people aware and alert to where the tripwires are, where they could make mistakes, where in fact they create risk. And E&O insurance is a big thing we talk about, but it's going to be broader than it has in the past, and it's going to cost more money in the past. And so it's going to affect the management of the company. I think the standards of practice is very important for us to think about in our brokerage. I just can't emphasize enough, because if there's a standard of practice, you're starting to minimize your risk. And if you're sitting in front of a judge and you say, we follow these procedures and here's our book on our procedures and we do these things, you're halfway to minimizing some of that risk that's coming your way. So the cost of risk management is going to go up. In the past, it was kind of like HR in most companies. HR was something that somebody did. It was like half. You found somebody who didn't have anything else to do and you made them an HR person, right? Right now, risk management is going to be a full-time job in most companies. It's going to require a legal background, or at least legal awareness, and it's going to require that people sign that they have read or they understood or they went to the class. So I think when you look at Rita and what she does in professional development, risk management is going to be more education, more of a class, and maybe even some certification. It's really hard to tell how far it's going to go, but the cost is going up, the risk is going up, and my sense is regulation and litigation are coming your way, and that's going to make it even more important to manage the risk in your company. Back to you.
So Jim is referring back to education on risk reduction and awareness. I know that the Texas Association of Realtors is working on some sort of multi-day program for the brokerage to kind of identify and look at some best practices and things that need to be included and incorporated, and some sort of certification that says, hey, I've dived deep into this area of education. But I think it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, Jeremy and I worked very closely on looking at what it would mean for brokers to have a standards of practice and best practices in their office that they incorporate for for your agents, right? Client experience. And now we're looking at a whole different area. Obviously, you all have as brokers your policy manual. It should be in your policy manual, but I think that the policy manual is going to have to be elevated to a point where it's very sophisticated and incorporates some very key identifiable things that if your agents aren't acting in that regard or following these rules, then they can't participate as an agent within your brokerage firm, right? Because you're going to be putting yourself at a risk beyond just losing potential clients and diving into a whole area of being sued because these policies and procedures weren't followed. So that's just we're moving beyond just the consumer expectations and best practices to create that 5-star experience, and more into, hey, let's make sure that you're following things so that you won't get sued and you won't create a, I guess back to the litigious environment. So,
yeah, I think it's not just the consumers that are bringing this litigation. It's the government at the state, local level, and also we're starting to see this administration is very, very focused. One of the statements that one of the representatives of the FTC said, the commission is ridiculous. Technology has made it so easy to be a realtor, they shouldn't charge that much money. There's an attitude that's coming your way. And those are the kind of things that you have to look at and say, how do we manage that? How do we not run afoul of the kind of rules that are coming down? So it's going to be expensive and it's going to be necessary. Back to you.
Right. Yes. And Peggy mentioned in the chat that the C2EX certification, yes, we have that out there and that we're going to be expanding upon that. And that'll be some of our efforts moving forward, fourth quarter and next year, to really try to heighten and increase that. So what basic elements comprise the traditional risk management environment, Jeremy?
Well, let me start by saying I'm not being critical here, but this is we really can't be political with respect to the subject of risk management. We have to kind of call it like it is. So let's go back and look at what some of the leading plays in risk management have been over the past 20 years. First of all, if we were going to give a score, I think we'd have to say probably, in my estimation, the score would be 6 out of 10 at best. We have not emphasized risk management. We haven't formalized risk management, and we haven't institutionalized risk management. So the elements of risk management we've seen involve the adherence to certain traditional cultural-based rules and regulations. So there was some stuff that you just didn't do, and everybody sort of knew that. It wasn't put in writing, but these are things that you just didn't do. And so people started using a culture-based rule to guide their behavior. So that was an important thing. Then we had the association-related professional standards activities. And again, narking was bad, and it was a bad practice in the real estate culture long before any other kind of thing. You just didn't tell on another one of your association members, and so people didn't. And so that set a whole standard of. So professional standards is certainly important, but many associations have someone else do it. Other associations, it becomes kind of a quasi-political activity. But professional standards programs in organized real estate did not effectively police or regulate the industry. The next group that we dealt with was state licensure commissions. Some time ago, licensure commissions moved from being regulatory to being financial. If you look in the state of Texas or anywhere else, these people, the tens or hundreds of thousands of license fees paid in have become an increasingly important source of revenue. So if you look at the actual regulatory activities of most state licensure, real estate licensure commissions, it's next to nothing, because that would have cut down on that revenue source, and we understand that. The limited brokerage-based transaction-related incident-related management activities. So when there's a fire or something goes wrong, that's when we up our risk management activities in most brokerages. They're not institutionalized and not formalized, but when something happens, then we pay attention to it, and that's a brokerage base. So again, not an effective tool. Then there were the classic malpractice behaviors, random malpractice behaviors committed by agents or people in the brokerage. So again, when there was when a complaint was filed and the evidence was presented, and by any number of resolution mechanisms, and then we did something about that. We look at the fact that MLSs, Lord bless their soul, the fact is that there has been a minimum level of enforcement of MLS rules and regulations, and again, that often becomes a political issue as opposed to a regulatory or policing issue. Inaccuracy of MLS listing data. It is, we're lucky here in Houston and we have one of the most effective MLSs in the country, but not so far away from Houston and other parts of the country, the MLS listing data or the accuracy rules are very, very, very shallow, not enforced, not even in some cases monitored. Another issue that we haven't done well on in this area is limited and generally ineffective brokerage privacy and data security standards. You can today walk into any number of offices and you'll see files sitting on the desk of the closing office, totally open to whoever happens to be there for a closing or any other kind of business. We really haven't respected that, and that's another characteristic, is that we're not really good at keeping the secret. Another one is the complaints filed as a result of alleged broker and agent unprofessional conduct with respect to consumers. I think have not done a great job in paying attention when a consumer does file a complaint. Really not much action would occur at any particular level. And then finally, actions arising as a result of complaints regarding any inappropriate interactions between agents and service providers. So again, we understand the need to do this, and we have tried to do risk management, but by and large, risk management has never never made inroads into our issues of profitability, our issues of professionalism. It's always been on the back burner. And if we absolutely had to, we'd pull out risk management and go after it. But generally speaking, it has not been an effective or continuing part of our practice. And I know there are probably brokers out there who are going to say, that's not true. It's always been. So the statistics, of course, would tell the story. And that is, how many actions have been taken against licensees or anyone else based on this. And you'll find the numbers are minimal at best. We may have had the mechanism, but as an industry, we have not enforced those. So that's really the characteristics of where we're starting from. We're probably starting at 6. And I think Jim and I would both agree that over the next 12 to 18 months, the outside external forces on our industry are going to require an 8 or an 8.5 just to meet the minimum requirements. So there is that currently that gap that we have to work on. Rita?
Yes. So yeah, and I agree. Again, kind of back to what you're talking about is how is this going to affect the brokerage community? And we've always had risk factors. We've always had outside factors. We've always had things coming in, but just to kind of reinforce the idea that it's coming in all different ways at a level that we've never seen before. We've heard the iceberg is melting story, but where are we now? And how are we going to be moving forward if we don't effectively put in place some best practices, take on some real high level education and time to investigate these things so you understand what it means for your business moving forward, and how can you not just just be sustainable, right? I mean, we've got some different things, and those that do dive deep and really make it a part of their practice is probably going to succeed, if not take advantage of these things as an opportunity. So Jim, how have the recent developments impacted the traditional risk management process, and what new factors are out there that have emerged?
Well, it doesn't take a genius to look at our industry and say the write-ups from Long Island, the write-ups about things that happened in Houston, the write-ups about discrimination and redlining, we thought all that was gone, but it wasn't gone. It just went underground. And so though every one of those is a risk factor, every single one of those cases can really be turned into something that's going to cost your brokerage a lot of money. So being aware, there's not the forgiveness there was in the past for a lot of those sort of things. So you're going to get, Jeremy pointed out, but I wanted to reiterate that you're going to have to discipline your organizations so that anyone who flagrantly disregards the risk issues, they're not your friend. You can't have a brokerage that allows that to go on. Because the other thing is, it signals the other people in the brokerage that it's okay to do those things. I had an interesting experience myself. We wanted to go look at a house. Nice house, a lot of money. And so the people said, we want to know that we only want qualified buyers to come see the house. So, but the agent on the buy side, our agent we worked with, said, I can get a letter from my friend, the broker, will say you're qualified. I'm going, that's just, so if we went in, if we gave that letter to the selling broker and they went through a transaction, or we started a transaction and we delayed the sale of that house because we really weren't qualified, whose problem is that? How does that manifest itself that you really didn't have a qualified letter? You really had a letter from your friend, the broker. I mean, it's just examples keep coming out of the woodwork. So let's look also at documentation. Documenting, setting up an awareness of risk factors and creating documentation so that your agents are aware of it. And so when you work with a consumer, that they know what the consumer bill of rights are, what are their rights and you need to live up to those rights. I mean, you're a professional, you're out there, and they're relying on you to give them guidance for a very major purchase. And so it doesn't matter whether that purchase is a $100,000 manufactured home or a $10 million home. They're relying on the agent to give them some guidance, some opinion. And so that's pretty interesting stuff. Documenting what you're doing, very important. The issues of litigation far exceed, I mean, all you need to do is have some bad press in a newspaper about actions that you've taken that have not been in the best interest of the consumer, and it really affects your business. And even though you didn't do it, you're the broker or you're the team leader, if it occurs on your watch, it occurred on your watch, right? That's something to understand. The expanded cause of action. So consumers right now are very aware of what their rights are in transactions, and whether they're buying a camera or whether they're buying a car or whether they're buying a house, they really understand that they're in the driver's seat, and they're asking for opinions and questions, and they're going to sue you. It's just if it's the wrong stuff, and if you didn't do your job, you're going to be in trouble. Performance agreements. So I want to go back to the legal side for a second. One of the cases coming before the court against NAR and several large brokerages is the idea that the transaction where the seller pays the buyer's fees, meaning realtor's fees, right? Just understand what's going on. There's a case going through the court. It'll take years, as Jeremy will tell you, but it really is trying to separate the buy-side fees from the buy-side commission from the seller commission. So what would that mean to your brokerage if all of a sudden buyer brokerage was a really important part? Are you aware of it? Do you understand it? Can you describe it? Can you tell your people how to do it? Because generally it's coming your way. There's going to be a lot of scrutiny. Right now, there's a lot of scrutiny just on being able to publish what the buy-side commission is. So be aware that it's coming your way. The other thing is the use of technology is good, but it also, you need to have a trail. You need to understand that an email about a property or an email about a condition on the property is discoverable. And in fact, you need to be aware if an agent says in an email, I'm sure the price of this house is going to go up. It's just in a neighborhood that's really the right place to be. And if it doesn't go up and that email's there, so I had a broker one time say, do you know how many washing machines I bought in my time? Because we wrote a contract that said it includes a washer. The seller never said it included a washer. The broker bought the washer, right? So, we're getting more and more and more into that area. That's damages are going to go higher and higher and higher. So use of technology, understanding what emails mean, understanding that it's all discoverable. It's kind of like social media. You go out and put an ad on social media that misrepresents, you're liable. So overall, a more competitive industry environment. We also have more competition for every transaction. And so Jeremy pointed out something that we rarely talk about, which is we don't hold each other to accountability. And so if you're running a brokerage and you know that the agent, maybe not your agent, but another agent, really didn't do their job or really misled, you need to start calling for accountability in the business. It's hard because we're a brotherhood, but you're not a brotherhood when you get to court. You're called a defendant, right? And so you need to really be aware. I suppose also, Jeremy and I will talk in several different ways about business model obsolescence. Is your business model keeping up with what consumers expect of you? Is your business model modernized? Are you looking to see what consumers really want? And are you willing to give it to them? And can you understand how to do that and not include more risk? If, for example, you say that you'll buy the house, right? If we don't sell it, we'll buy the house. Do you really mean that? You know, what is it? What kind of risk did you just put yourself into if that's either a broker saying that or it's an agent saying that? So just be aware. Documentation, very important. Electronic messages are discoverable, and it's really hard to think about. It's kind of like trying to tell your kids that what they have on social media will show up in a job interview. Do they really want all that in a job interview? Do they really want somebody to know all those things? So be aware, you know, and make your people aware that when you write an email about a property or about a client, you better be sure you're not creating another area for risk. So, you know, that's a lot of things to remember, because we didn't have these things before. You know, we didn't have it, and we also didn't have consumers that are aware of being able to discover those things and say, hey, you know, I got an email that said whatever. So it's going to cost you more money. You're going to have to do a better job. And as Jeremy points out, we need to be an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10, or it's going to cost us money. That's it, Rita. That's all I got.
Well, and Teresa Teresa Hill made a message in the chat talking about, you know, lines of communication includes text messaging. You know, when you have your messenger on your social media platforms, those aren't private conversations. They don't just go away. They can be legally binding, and they can come back to, you know, to be substantially detrimental in different cases. If, you know, so, you know, just need to be very intentional. And I think that goes along with, you know, your policies and procedures to incorporate your practices with, you know, your agents and communicating with their clients and making sure it's very clear that, you know, that's incorporate when you're talking about lines of communication and where and what you post things and share data and information, that maybe should include those social media and various communication paths. You know, there's just all different ways now that could put people in a situation that could be harmful for their business. So thank you, Jim. I think we've got a question from Mishika. It says, is there a place where reminder information like this is warehoused and accessible to help brokers and agents keep these things front of mind? Or is there a broker training checklist, perhaps? This comes up in GRI class, TACS, always seems to be revelation to students and colleagues. So we do have a video series on HARTV that we're working on, and I think that that's going to come into elevating those educational opportunities and looking at having different methods for communicating those, Mish. So I think, yes, we are expanding that and, you know, looking at best practices, what needs to be included in those policy manuals, and just trying to raise awareness. So we are working on that. And, but yeah, it's just folks like you on the call today, it's more important than ever that you don't just hold this information near and dear to your heart. You spread the word and are ambassadors to this information and kind of lead the way, pave the way. And that's why we have a standalone risk management advisory group. That's all about what we do is effectively communicate with the membership about issues that you all are facing and how to mitigate or reduce some of those factors. So Jeremy, how will the emerging risk management environment differ from the traditional one?
Let's just take a second to do a review of what we've talked about over the last 45 minutes. So first of all, what we recognize is that either coincidentally or organically, the results of our last 3 years experience, including the pandemic, has changed pretty much everything that we do. Now that's an interesting argument, because lots of people don't believe that. Lots of people, oh, I'm doing the same thing I did 20 years ago. Well, you may be doing the same thing, but your world and your marketplace and your customer and your contacts aren't doing the same thing. So first of all, things are significantly different. If you haven't added up the ways, this would be a good time to figure out how they're different. Secondly, new things create new liabilities. As Jim pointed out, every time you add a function to your list, you're going to have another piece of risk attached to that, and the risk will increase. The people who you're dealing with are now significantly different. So there's no question that this is going to happen. So our job is to say to you, this is going to take some time. It's not going to happen in 6 months, but it may happen in 12 to 18 months. So the first thing that will happen is that risk management is now going to become much more mandatory and formal. It is not simply something we're going to find out who on the administrative staff has an hour and a half a week to do something. You bang, you're the risk management director. That's not going to be the case. It's going to be, by the time all of these sanctions come into play, it'll be much more important than that. Secondly, risk management will become a significant line item expense. Now, we all understand that what's happening now is broker profitability, by and large, is not at its highest level ever and is not trending in that direction, and that broker expenses are going up. Now we're saying to you, boo, here's another expense. Risk management is now going to become a line item. You're going to say, here's what we're going to do, here's what it's going to, who's going to do it, and here's what it's going to cost. Formal risk management will also become tied to your professional insurance eligibility. Now, assumedly most of you have some level of insurance which covers various risks. That insurance is going to go up because the level of risk that's being covered will go up. So that's going to cost more. And what you'll begin to see is your ability to get this insurance will, to a greater extent than ever, be tied to certain actions you've taken, the ones that we're talking about now. If you choose to do nothing, then those rates will go way up. But there's some ways to ameliorate the waste. So risk managers programs are about to become impactive, influential, and yes, invasive. They're going to jump right in the middle of the traditional relationship between brokers and their agents, because while it is true there's certain limitations. Now you're going to have rules, and Jim called them standards of practice. That's actually a word that the court is going to call them. You may call them policies, but when they go to court, the court will call them standards and standards of practice. Now, recognize that if you don't set up standards of practice in your firm, then third parties will do so, and courts will be one of those third parties. And defendants will plaintiffs will bring in witnesses that say, this is how this should happen. And you're going to say, well, that's never happened that way. That's not the way we do it. That's not going to make it. You're going to have a response to say, here's how we respond to that. Here's how we deal with the growing risk involved in real estate transactions. So what you'll see is that it's going to impact every aspect of your world. Now, it's going to require a higher level of accurate communication between sellers, buyers, and brokerage participants. I had an opportunity professionally to be involved in the medical malpractice crisis in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And every case that came up, there was a moment in time when communication would have solved the issue, and the ultimate defendants had a choice to be informative, transparent, or just plain arrogant. And arrogant is when you choose to say to the person who feels that they've been damaged, sorry, Charlie, I'm worried about you. So that's this idea of having accurate communications and documented communications between the people in your brokerage and the people they interact with. You have to be able to prove in court what you said, what your intent was, and generally show yourself to be a creative person interested in doing this. If you don't, that's going to be problematic. The role of risk management insurance, by the way, because as the price of insurance goes up, as the incident of litigation and awards from judges and juries goes up, so will the price of your insurance. But more importantly, if you study what happens in the risk management insurance industry, in the insurance industry across the board, at some point you become too much of a hot potato. When you're not doing anything, when you're not solving the problem, they're not interested in insuring you at any price. So you're going to have to establish the fact that you're aware of the risk management crisis, you're taking positive steps to stop it, and that's you're going to have to establish that, and that's going to be important. So the cost of the mere fact that the cost of risk management products going up will affect your profitability. So will the cost of maintaining effective risk management, effective and well-staffed risk management practices will further impact profitability. This will be one of the forces, by the way, which will drive the the whole idea of firms getting together, the consolidation movement, because it's really going to be difficult for you to underwrite the cost of a full-fledged risk management program for a smaller firm. If you can take that same program and spread it over a larger number, we've actually talked about the fact that perhaps the Houston Association of Realtors should consider whether or not this is a service it could offer, but you have to realize it's going to cost a lot of money, and figure out where that is. Risk management activities across the board are going to require higher levels of documentation. That can make you groan, but again, if you don't have the paper, then you don't have the evidence, then you can't establish your case, either no matter what the fact-finding form is, whether you're in some sort of mediation or in a full-fledged court trial, you're going to have these records. Risk management activities are going to require much higher levels of accountability and transparency than other areas of brokerage management. The fact is, there's a lot of folks in our business who sort of fly by night, and they do whatever they got to do to get the deal across. You're going to have to take a long look at that. And that's why the standards of practice and the brokerage is going to have to protect itself by being able to say, here's how we handle this. And I think ultimately, in my mind, perhaps the biggest issue here is that risk management activities will strain the traditional brokerage agent relationship. Indeed, brokers are going to be in a position to say, hey, this is how we deal with this. Don't use the word policy. Policies are just the way you'd like it to be. Standards of practice is the way you're going to want it to be to protect yourself against all the risk management dangers. So and that's going to strain the broker agent relationship. And it's and the culture, if you we've worked with several brokerages in the Houston area to identify their culture. And this new level of risk management is going to have a serious impact on most brokerage cultures and their cultural environment, because they're not used to, in fact, saying, this is how it's going to be. If you want to work here, here's how you're going to be. And certainly they're not used to having a client or potential buyer seller walk in the door and say, tell me how you handle these issues. So it's a serious thing. And if there's a time element, again, now is the time to start working on it. Now is the time to at least begin to set up the framework of a formal risk management program. Now is the time to begin to impact your firm's culture so that these things happen automatically. But it's going to be disruptive. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of questions, some that you guys may have some response to, or some that want to defer, but has there been any discussion on requiring agents to carry E&O or expanding the liability to the sponsored agents? I think that's, as the broker, you're incurring the liability and agreeing to sponsor somebody, but what do you think about that?
Well, I'd say it really doesn't matter who picks up the tab for the insurance. When it's all said and done, the insurance carrier is going to say, here's what you have to have in place to get any insurance, regardless of who's going to pay for it. So if the idea is to somehow that brokers can defer liability by shifting it over to agents, that won't solve any problems. It just may have more parties to the issue. But I think it's I don't know what discussions have occurred. There are other folks who get to be in government affairs and political affairs and all that kind of stuff. But I would say that there better be some discussions. I think that the idea that something this big is that we can somehow duck it, or we can somehow get the state legislature to say you can't sue realtors anymore. Probably not a big chance of that. Jim probably has some ideas on that.
It's interesting. You can spread the cost around, but I've been licensed in several states. I'm not a practicing realtor, but I get licensed for a lot of different reasons. In most states, the broker has the responsibility to supervise the agent's activity. So you can't sign away liability, as any lawyer will tell you. you can't put up a sign in your office that says, we're not responsible for our agents, right? I mean, you just can't do that because they work for the brokerage. There is a line of accountability that goes down. So you may well say to the agents, my E&O insurance has gone up, and therefore out of every transaction you do, $5 goes into this pot. But it's probably the person that did one transaction that cost you the liability. It's probably not a person that's done 20 transactions. And so you just have to kind of look at that. I will tell you that the whole idea of building a culture within your company that says we do the right thing. Now, I got to go back and tell you, I've been a salesman all my life. I've sold lots of stuff and I love being a salesperson. But the nature of a salesperson, one time I had a shrink tell me that the nature of the salesperson was if they have a thimble and they're trying to sell you a thimble and there's a little crack in the thimble, your job as a salesperson to tell them that doesn't exist, or you're looking at it wrong, or that builds character in the thimble, this crack, right? And you need one of these, right? Salespeople are about overcoming objections. And we have to be very careful that in overcoming objections, we don't overstep our knowledge base about that particular property or that particular deal or that particular. So, when you establish adherence to standards of practice, one of those standards of practice is to know how far out on that limb you go as an advisor before you start running into a little risk out there. So programs that introduce formal risk in a company culture are very important. That's really difficult. I mean, you got 4,500 agents. Creating a culture for 4,500 people is very difficult. Creating a culture for 100 people is difficult. But it's about protecting the agency, the broker, and the company from the actions of the people that work there. Every boss in America has that issue right now. So the other thing is enforcing the policy. I know very few companies that ever fired an agent. I know a lot of companies that should have fired some agents, but they don't do it because it's like, well, that agent could bring in more transactions. And so that's what we're all about. However, that agent is creating a liability for you that you can't afford. And so not adhering to the company standards and standards of practice should be cause for termination. It shouldn't just be, gee, you shouldn't do that, Bobby. That's not a good thing. And so we're talking about, it's easy for us too, because I don't have a real estate company. So it's easy for me to tell you what to do. I will just tell you that if you don't do it, the liability goes up for every month you go by and you don't set standards of practice in your organization. And so if you don't do anything else, set standards of practice and make agents sign that they read the standards of practice and that to not adhere to the standards of practice is cause for termination. That's what you got to do. That's how it has to work. Any more questions?
Can you hear me? Nope. That's it. Somebody actually just came to my Ring doorbell and I was trying to tell them that I couldn't listen, but I was listening to you. So technology is awesome. Okay. So I heard what you were saying. I agree 100%. Mishka kept in with a question about where do we take the position on negligent referral? She has an in-house rule that we are the source of the source, but we make no direct referrals to any service provider, mitigate our risk in case the professional lender, roofer, inspector, etc., is perceived by the consumer to have done something wrong. I mean, I can think this report goes back to when we used to say we have 3 inspectors that we give you as recommendations, but we're not saying this is the one that's going to provide the best service. Is that kind of the same idea behind that?
I think so, yeah.
And then talking about a standards of practice, like I mentioned earlier, Jeremy and I years ago created a best practices that we kind of put a checklist on our site. These are the things that brokerages need to consider for them to relay back to their agents for client experience, right? To ensure that they're given that gold star standard. I don't know. I think somebody had asked about the association creating that or finding something that would be out there in an organized way to incorporate. So I think that, that's kind of what we're trying to do with these programs, is to lay out in some way for things you guys to consider. Reach out to, get with your attorney, have somebody on staff that's got some legal knowledge, and be able to put those standards of practice in a way that's formal and organized.
I don't know that anybody does it, but it would be very worthwhile to have an outside auditor, if you will, not an auditor, a risk management audit of your company that you can find out. And you can also show your company and the participants in the company, this is how we rate on this by the particular audit. Because it's hard to do it yourself. It's hard to look around and say, that guy over there, he's creating risk. But if you had an audit that looked at your business and said, here's where your risk areas are, you need to correct them, that's not a bad idea.
Yeah, so I think that's where you're talking about what risk management procedures and policies should the brokerage consider in order to manage the new risk environment, right? So let's dive into that.
Jeremy and I just happen to have an audit company that we're going to sell everybody.
Yeah.
Doesn't cost much, but
10 minutes.
Yeah. No, we're describing an area here that when you go back and sit and look at it, you go, you know what? It costs money to do what we're talking about, and as Jeremy pointed out, brokerage profitability is under attack. It's been for a long time, and so. When you look out there, the question is, can you afford it? But more importantly, can you afford not to do this? So it's a hard business decision to put more overhead into your company, but I think this is a worthwhile place to spend some money. And we don't have a program and we're not selling you anything. I just want to make sure. Jeremy might say, no, I'm just kidding.
You promised.
I think that Saeed was mentioning the TAR does have a model brokerage policies and procedure manual. I know that there are a lot of folks that use that, and that's great. It's a base, to have a foundation, but I think that kind of what we're talking about is going to even go beyond just that basic level of product. But yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely the great start, right? So even beyond that.
So Rita, just a couple of other things for folks who are looking for a checklist, if you will. So I think that the most important thing is going to be to establish brokerage-centric, customized professional standards. That if you don't have a rule, then you can't enforce where you want to be. Secondly, you have to have a program that affects the culture and drives absolute compliance with professional standards that you've developed. Lastly, develop and enforce ramifications and consequences. I mean, our professional standards program, the mere fact that no one could ever know about it. I mean, that's been one of the hallmarks of that program, is that nobody can ever know, consumers or other members of the association, what happened about it. That program needs to have formal risk procedures, which would include transactional auditing, periodic training, testing, and those types of things. And that training, again, it's got to be something that carries with it an examination, some way to determine that the message got across, and making sure that the documentation will support the brokerage and its activities in the event of litigation or any particular question. And I think, again, that in this day and age, the last thing I would suggest that you think about doing is promoting the competitive advantage of a strong risk management program from a consumer perspective, and make it part of the company's value proposition. We are the only company in Houston that has this type of program to protect you. It's okay. It may not make you popular at the next association event, but it will make you quite popular, we think, in terms of the consumer. So these are absolute things that you can get started on now, but what you'll discover is the first time someone stands up in a meeting at the company and says, here's what we're going to do, you got to be willing to stand behind it. And that's no small potatoes.
So we've covered kind of a lot of ground on those traditional factors that are coming in, some intentional actions that the brokerage community can take. Is there anything that, I know we talked about leasing and the idea of the rental nation. We've talked about the lawsuits and the things that we normally think of when we talk about risk. Anything organically outside of these spectrums that, you know, might want to really kind of start to consider as important risk factors and how those might impact?
Yeah, I would say the advent of the rental nation, the idea that rentals are going to become a very important part of any broker's business, and have some idea about what does a rental lease look like? What are the conditions, and how do we answer the questions when somebody asks us about rental property? So I think that's an area we're going to have to spend some time on. That's a little outside of risk management, but it is risk management in the sense that you need to be able to represent yourself as having some knowledge in that area.
Yeah, and I think that based on what you're saying is, you know, those that practice leasing or property management within a, you know, they all, there's a lot of liability there, and it's continued to grow. And then with the spike in you know, affordability, or the lack of affordability moving forward, people are going to tend to gravitate towards leasing properties, right? And so what is that going to do? That's going to look at the agents, and they're going to say, hey, I'm going to have to start doing business in a different way, maybe looking to leasing as a more of an option for how I do business. And what does that mean? It means understanding the policies, understanding the forms, understanding the best practices as it relates to them. And then the broker doing what they can to ensure there's an SOP in there as well, so that they remove some of that liability or reduce some of that risk. And we're actually, I'll talk about it in a minute, we're going to have a webinar, and then one of our key speakers in our September event will be centered all around that concept, because that's kind of where we're going from what we can see. Anything environmentally related or outside of the traditional factors besides the two things, or three or few things that we talked about, that come to top of mind?
I think
go ahead, Jim.
Environmentally, it's probably the hottest ticket item right now in real estate is being able to look at a property and know, is it in a flood zone? What goes on? What about this particular property? As databases are created, some are good and some are just kind of the flood map revisited. But I think it's important to realize that as the consumer is made aware of environmental issues, they're going to ask the realtor for information about it. And I think getting more knowledge about all the environmental issues is really important. I mean, it's another tripwire that says, oh no, it never floods there, right? And so, yeah, that's another big one that's coming your way, and it has to be part of standard practices. It has to be part of your knowledge base about the area you're serving. Is what are the environmental issues? And you know, when you look at some of these big fires, for example, from industrial complexes, I didn't know it was there. Nobody told me, that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, I think environmental issues are big and getting bigger.
Yeah, and just thinking about you know, not just floods, but overall hazards, like you mentioned. You know, client transparency to the client with affordability, and we, you know, not putting the agent or the broker in a situation where they're saying this is what it is, right? But making sure that through the line of best practices and kind of the checklist of what do you share with your potential consumer. Hey, you need to do some research and do some due diligence to make sure that, yeah, you can afford this house, you can afford this note, but we live in an area where, you know, maybe flood insurance is crazy, or electricity, your electricity bill is going to be exceptionally higher than maybe you consider. So looking at how do you communicate with the consumer the things that they need to go through and look at, because you don't want to take that on and say, oh yeah, here's the last 3 months of electricity bill from Joe Seller, right? And then they come back 6 months later and say, my agent told me that I was only going to have to pay this much in my electricity bill, and now I've, it's 3 times that. So putting some just communication pieces out there to make sure that there's awareness and you're kind of taking that off of your plate, so to speak.
Yep.
Yeah.
Limiting liability is what you're talking about, right?
Yep. Yep. Anything else, Jeremy?
I guess if this is the final opportunity, please take this seriously. I know that it's just so easy to say, yeah, we should do something about this, but in place right now, these are not things we're talking about that are going to happen. These are things that are already in one form or another on their way to your office now. And if you get caught at the last minute and you haven't made any preparations, that's the worst case scenario here. So please take it seriously. If there's any way that we can help, talk to Rita, and she's got a world of assets and data and knowledge, and this is a perfect example of why associations are important, because everyone's issue here is pretty much the same. So let's get on it.
Any questions for Jim or Jeremy beyond the scope of what we've discussed, or maybe a little bit deeper into some of the things that they've asked or that they've presented?
All right. No.
Yes, NARPM, National Association of Residential Property Management, is a great reference for property management for rentals. We do have some classes that are centered all around leasing and how to specialize in leasing, property management. We partner with NARPM because that's, again, a whole new, a whole area, the real estate transaction world that our members need to be privy to. And so anything else? Any other questions? Okay, y'all are quiet. So thank you. I really appreciate everybody attending. Thanks to Jim and Jeremy for their exhaustive research, for always keeping up to date and giving us the information in such a digestible, informative way. Love seeing that. And then as a guest, of course, I mentioned that you're going to receive a recording. I just want to remind you that on August 24th, we do have a webinar centered around the new forms for leasing, for residential leasing. And we're going to discuss some risk reduction methods behind that. We're going to talk about it. NARPM will be there and accounted for as representatives for our engagement that day. Again, it'll be 12 to 1:30. It is available for you to register now. And then on September 28th, please mark your calendars. We're going to have an in-person event, have at least 2, if not 3 subject matter experts coming in and speaking to all of the things that are happening right now. We'll have several subject matter experts, like they're said, speaking on the event. And the idea will be to prioritize which of some of these topics today were discussed and make sure that we bring those to you as brokers, and then kind of share ideas and steps to take to reduce that risk. So if I'm here, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information, my email is on there. I'm always receptive to ideas or thoughts or questions. And if you don't have anything else, thanks again. And I hope to see you all soon. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Jeremy.
You bet.
Thanks, Rita.
Thank you.